Hi, in this video I'm going to explain what happens, the process and the mechanics for when you enter into a new zone onto the map. In this example I've got a couple of allied infantry and a Sherman's just off screen, and I'm going to go move them, spend command points and move them into this zone. So this is the process that you'll go through as the player to determine what happens in the zone and what, if any, enemies are in that zone that you encounter. The first thing you do is you roll on a chart to determine whether there are enemies or whether the zone is clear or if there are random events. It's a simple chart. You're rolling a d6, and if you get a 5 or a 6, it's clear and there are no enemies. Great. If you get a 1 through to 4, then there'll be enemies and a random, depending on what dice roll you get, a chance of a random event as well. So let's say, for the sake of argument, if it's clear, great, no problem, that's that zone done, no combat, you can move on to the next zone and so forth. But let's suppose that I roll a 1, which in this case would be a random event and enemies. So what we have, these are my developer charts that I'm constantly tweaking at the minute. The first thing you'll do is you will consult the random event chart. There aren't a huge number of charts in this game, but this is an important one. And what this does is basically you roll 2d6, the first number and the second number, to determine what random event that you encounter. Some of the random events will help the player and a lot will hinder the player. So for example, as you move into this zone, if I rolled a 12, so I roll a 1 and then a 2, making 12, then I encounter Booby Traps, which means I have to roll for every infantry counter. And if I roll for every one die per 1, if any of them get 6, that infantry counter is pushed back, for example. Once I've done that, then I will then roll for the enemy. So I do the random encounter first, if that's what I got as a result, and then I do the enemies. Some of the random encounters help the player. For example, let's pick one here. There's a random event called local intel, and I get an extra recon counter that I can use in the game. Another random encounter is inspired. I get an extra free rally for that turn for the game. For example, I get battle hardened. This would pertain to combat. I can re-roll my combat dice. So if I was in combat and I roll that random event, battle hardened, when I fight the infantry, for example, then I'll be re-rolling my attack dice. That's covered in the combat video that I did. If you want to see how combat works, but basically there are over 30 different random events that you can roll on the chart, and some of them will hinder and some of them will help you. And they're written in a very sort of flavoursome way. They add an element of unpredictability to the game, and it's something that as a player you will have to contend with. But as I said, some help, some hinder. Now once I've been through that chart and I've worked out if there's a random event, then I'll roll on the next chart, and that will determine what the enemy forces are. Now this chart I'm still I'm working on, because as part of the Kickstarter I've got some stretch goals for additional enemy units for the game, both if you're playing as the Germans or if you're playing as the Allies, depending on the scenario you're playing. But the way the chart works is very simple. You first roll to determine what armour, AFVs, you'll encounter. If you're unlucky and you're playing as the Allies and you roll to get a Tiger, then there'll be a Tiger. Sometimes you may roll to get, say for example, a Panzer IV or a Panzer IV and a Panther, for example. It's not always one. You might encounter several different pieces of enemy armour. Once you've worked that out, then you'll roll on the chart to see what infantry counters you'll encounter. Might be a solitary infantry counter, or an infantry counter and an MG42 counter, and so forth. And again, there are a variety. We've got a mortar counter there, for example. You might encounter 3. Let's pick some really bad luck. On this case, you roll on the enemy encounter table, and you encounter infantry and MG42 mortars, a Panther and a Panzer IV against your 2 infantry counters and a lone Sherman. That will then, once you've done that, then you're into combat and you can start making those combat decisions. So you're moving into an area, you're determining what, if any, events and enemies are in that area, and then you'll roll on a couple of charts to see what those random events are and what enemies you encounter. And as I said, some of those random events do pertain to combat. Some of them will help you, some of them will hinder you. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how that part works. Now, also I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what happens when you have a controlled zone. So a controlled zone is when you've been through a zone, you've defeated the enemy. Upon leaving the zone, you put one of these counters on the zone, and that is now controlled in the game. If you want to, you can leave a counter in the zone, as many as you want. You don't have to, and there's a reason you may want to, and that's because in the turn segment, there's a phase where you're going to roll on a chart to determine what happens in all your controlled zones. And again, there's a separate chart. To be honest with you, invariably nothing will happen, but occasionally the enemy will have snuck in to one of the controlled zones that you control, and then again you'll be determining whether they have, and rolling on the chart to see what happens if they do. Let's say, for example, you've got you roll the dice and the enemy are in the zone. Okay, while they're in the zone, you remove that. That is now another enemy zone. So as the player, you will have to choose. In this example, that would be blocking a line of supply into that zone if the player started from the far left of the map here. In that case, as the player, when it comes to your next movement phase, you may determine you actually want to go back into that zone and engage those enemies, because you'll be now out of supply. And out of supply, not always a good place to be in. So yeah, it's not, like I said, it's not too many charts. I think I've got about 4 charts at the moment. Once the Kickstarter's finished and I've worked out all the content for the game, and by that I mean all the different types of German, Axis and Allied different counters, I'll finish up those charts, do a graphical design pass on them, and they'll be both in the rulebook and as a separate player aid. So you can just print that sheet out and just use that chart. There's not many, like I said, I think at the minute I have about 4 charts in total for the game, something like that. So not a huge amount for you to go through, and you just go through them in sequence. It's very straightforward. I hope that was useful, and thanks for watching as always.